Now let's get on with a conversation with someone who certainly has a keen eye for what's happening in the world, a towering figure in what I call observational journalism, Malcolm Gladwell, author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Talking to Strangers, David and Goliath, Outliers, Blink, and The Tipping Point. He is the co-founder and president of Pushkin Industries, an audiobook and podcast production company that produces podcasts such as Revisionist History, Broken Record, one of my personal favorites, a music interview show, and Solvable, in which Gladwell interviews innovative thinkers who have come up with solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. Malcolm, welcome.
Thank you.
Looks like you are in a podcast studio.
I am. I am in the Pushkin podcast studio.
World headquarters. Is that New York City?
No, we're... I live in the Hudson Valley, so we're a couple hours north of the city.
Ah, it's beautiful up there. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Signal. Thank you for being part of this. Given the past 18 months, I imagine you probably have some keen observations about patterns that may have emerged in culture and society. So let's start there. We spoke earlier, and you said you thought the pandemic had, and I'm quoting you here, made people more thoughtful. What did you mean by that?
Well, any kind of disruption, you know, I've always been struck by the fact that people, we are loath to re-examine our assumptions and predictions and all manner of things in the normal course of events, except when there is some kind of crisis. In other words, there's something discontinuous rather about our thinking, that we're when we're that lovely phrase from the 2008 financial crisis, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, is all about that idea, right? That only in very specific moments of high tension or disruption are we compelled to rethink our positions on things. And that's why crises are such enormous opportunities, right? But it also, the flip side of that is that normally we don't do that, right? I mean, when everything's sailing along, we aren't going to re-examine our thinking. So that's what I meant with that comment.
So have you noticed some patterns in how our thinking or our assumptions have changed?
Well, I mean, the obvious ones are this question of what does work look like, and that's to me the kind of one of the less interesting ones. The more interesting ones are our attitudes towards science and technology, which I think, more and more and more I am puzzled and by the way in which the vaccine response has gone, by the inability of our institutions to properly explain the benefits of this technology to the American public. That strikes me as being, that is not what I expected. I would have expected 85% vaccine take-up by now. So it strikes me the fact that we're, among adult Americans, I think we're still at less than 50% double-dosed, I don't actually think this is just specific to vaccines. I think this is about some larger disconnect between institutions and the broader American public, but more specifically about some larger change in the way people view the products of science and technology. And that is what I think is the most striking thing to come out of this.
Do you have any sense of why you think it is that we haven't had a broader uptake? Is there some greater insight as to, how are we failing to tell the narrative? I mean, you're a storyteller. What's the story that's not being told here?
Yeah. Well, one is that our government institutions and our political institutions appear to be really badly equipped for this kind of persuasion. So I'm not the first person who said that. The FDA, I think, has botched this from beginning to end. they've failed to understand that their job is not just to ensure that something safe and effective gets out, but it is also to make sure that the public is prepared to accept the findings of the FDA. And I just, no part of what they've done has struck me as being adequate. Also, I see a complete absence of political leadership on this. The idea that it's up to governors and mayors to run a vaccination campaign is nuts. This is something that has to be kind of, and the way it's been framed has been, to my mind, so amateurish. You know, the idea that I keep looking for and don't see is that the reason you get vaccinated is not because of your own personal risk profile. It is because of your obligation to others. You're trying to save the life of your grandparents or your parents or your, and like that is, we know that those kinds of altruistic frames can be very, very powerful in times of crisis. And there has been none of that in the kind of broader messaging. And I find that astonishing. We used altruistic messaging to extraordinary effect in the Second World War and numerous crises. Why, as a society, are we incapable of framing our messages in that way? Have we lost all of our moral language? Like that, you know, I find that astonishing. Like, it's almost like there has been a wholesale retreat from any kind of claim, any kind of ethical claim in the public sphere. We don't know how to make those arguments anymore. All we can do are these kinds of, is frame things in terms of individual self-interest. And if that's where we are right now, we are greatly impoverished as a nation.
Well, I appreciate your optimism, Malcolm. You know, but you've been an observer of culture for a long time. Can you trace the roots of this, or do you have a sense that possibly this is fleeting, or might it shift?
Yeah, you know, I don't. This is a question for a much longer conversation. So, basically, you know, these sorts of, the moral language that I'm looking for in this discussion is a language about our collective responsibilities and our responsibilities to those who are different from ourselves or maybe less fortunate from ourselves. Those kinds of claims to work effectively, or that kind of conversation to operate effectively, requires practice. And I think we're really out of practice. You know, it's easier in the Second World War, you know, when you have a draft and absolutely everybody is being asked to serve their country. And also when you're at a time in American society when religiosity is the dominant mode of being. And so people are, again, familiar with and well practiced in the language of morality and the language of collective obligations. Neither of, you know, so I could go down the list. There's probably 10 things that have happened in our society in the last 30 years to make us fall out of practice in those kinds of ways of thinking. But they have consequences. You know, if you're not talking about our collective responsibilities, you know, you don't know, you're faced with a problem like COVID, and you don't have any existing mechanisms for pulling people together.
So it makes me think about, there was a recent study, I think it was from Pew, it's done every year, in which you know, a large sample of people are asked the same question every year. You know, where do you place your trust? In what institution, what kind of an organization? And the answers are sort of 3 or 4 buckets. It's religion, education, government, and corporations. This year was the first year that corporations ranked #1 as the place where, you know, collective trust is most you know, imbued. What's your view on the role of the corporation in society? From a glancing perspective, it seems to be increasing. You know, we've spent the last day and a half talking about the role that companies have had. We just had Mary Barra on from GM talking about their commitment to sustainability and to diversity. These were often sort of taken as empty, pledges over the past 10 or 20 years, but they seem to have become quite central to this dialogue, the conversation that you and I are having. What's your thought on that?
Well, what you're seeing is corporations stepping into the breach. So there's been a void. As government has become less capable of having these kinds of conversations, as we've seen kind of Congress and Washington fall into gridlock and dysfunction, what has happened is what you would expect has happened, which is more functional institutions in this country have stepped forward. It's interesting on those trust things, the one government institution that remains relatively high in trust is the military, which is, a very functional public institution in this country. And so that's what happens, in these situations is the people who know how to have conversations, to go back to my earlier point, what is the military very good at? Having conversations about collective responsibilities and about sacrifice and about, right? That's a core thing for them. Similarly, corporations have an awful lot of practice in how to communicate effectively with a wide range of people, right? I mean, Procter & Gamble isn't just good at talking to wealthy consumers or consumers in the Midwest, or you have to talk to everybody. Now, the number of institutions in American society that are well practiced in that range of conversations is small.
Right.
Same with General Motors, right? The reason Mary Barra can have that conversation is that General Motors has been talking to everyone for 100 years now, or more than 100 years.
Right, right.
That's a pretty powerful group of experiences.
Yeah, exactly. I want to shift over to your observations around the generations and sort of this flattening that occurred, over the past year and a half, where it seemed to me, anyways, every one of us became like a kid. We were all glued to our screens, for 18 months. What are your observations of the distinctions between the generations that have grown up with those screens and the generations that either have adapted to them, like my own, or still view them as sort of that thing that happened that they're not really a part of? What do you see between those generations?
Many, many differences. I mean, the broader conceptual one is, we're in the middle of this society-wide shift from the hierarchy to the network, from vertical organizations to horizontal organizations, and the younger generation are people who have no familiarity with or patience with hierarchies, and who have embraced right from the beginning their whole way of living is inside the network. So they're much more interested in openness. Their notions of organizations are very participatory. They're distrustful of centralized leadership. All those are things that we've been living with for the last 10, 15, 20 years. The thing that's coming out of COVID, the thing that's weird to me is, and it's funny, I had a really fascinating conversation with someone on this just the other day. This tension between teamwork and individual work, that we have been moving in the business world more and more towards the team being the centerpiece of business activity, right? And yet at the same time, we have a generation coming up now who has got one foot in the team world because they're obviously highly connected, but one foot not. Like if you think about the dominance of social media as a medium of expression is the opposite of teamwork. It is the elevation of the self as a kind of principal component of conversation, of interaction. Mm-hmm. And that's weird, right? That's not what. So if I was designing a kind of new adolescents from scratch to prepare people for what working in the 21st century is like. Social media would have no part of that. That's not the direction. The idea that somebody would be a kind of prisoner of their phone and interacting with themselves at the center of a series of these kind of one-off interactions, I wouldn't do that at all, right? What I would really be doing is trying to think about how can I get people to function in effective self-managing groups. And that's like somehow there's, I thought that my sense 5 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have said that the demands of the contemporary workforce and the way in which young people were being socialized were pretty much in sync. But now I'm worried that the opposite is happening, that there's now a divergence between what companies want from their younger employees and what young people are being socialized to do. And particularly, don't even get me started on how I think the biggest culprit in all this is the schools, who I think are pursuing an educational philosophy which is completely 100% out of sync with what business organizations want. I mean, what are they thinking? Have the deans of American colleges spent any time inside a modern corporation? Like, why are they are preparing children and students, young adults, to work in solo, right? And then they turn around and send them into organizations where no one wants you to work by yourself, where your effectiveness is almost entirely a function of how well you can work together with other people. Like, this is crazy. It's totally crazy. It's like we are educating people exactly the same way today as we did in the 19th century, with really, really minor changes around the edges, right? It's 19th century education. And it's like, I find this more, if I was the CEO of, Procter or General Motors or any of these, I would be tearing my hair out. I was like, what are you doing? You're charging these kids hundreds of thousands of dollars for an education that is completely incompatible with what people are required to do once they graduate.
Wow, you're echoing the conversation we had yesterday with Scott Galloway. He was going off on the very similar topics. In the last couple of minutes we have, I want to hear about your latest book. On its face, one would say, well, it's interesting, but what lessons are there in there for business? But actually, when you and I discussed it last, it strikes me there are quite a few, especially as it relates to how do you make change in organizations used to doing things a certain way. So your book is about the Los Angeles Police Department. I grew up as a citizen under that police department. So tell us about the book and some key insights you're learning as you explore it.
Yeah, so this is a book I've just started to work on. It's after finishing The Bomber Mafia. But it's funny, this new book, which is a history of kind of how the LAPD lost its way and why, and what it took to change it, is actually really similar in themes to my last book, The Bomber Mafia, which was, The Bomber Mafia is a story about a group of outcasts down in Alabama who decide that everything that the army is doing to fight wars is wrong and think they can fix it, and set about this kind of epical attempt at transforming one of the oldest and most established institutions in American life. And then my new book is a kind of smaller version of that. It's like there has been this attempt in America over the last 100 years to figure out what is the best way to police a community. And, we need only remember back to last summer to understand that we're still a long way from coming up with an answer to that. And the LAPD is a kind of fascinating case study of that ongoing struggle. And it's a struggle with all kinds of parallels to the business world, because you have this, if you think about what it means to police a city like Los Angeles, you have a large and very, very diverse customer base. You have an evolving set of technologies that affect the way in which you you impose law and order on that community, and you have this insanely complicated management problem, which is you're managing a group of people on the street who are required to act with a very wide degree of discretion. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a very modern problem. You know, the police, the modern kind of high-tech 21st century organization, corporate organization, looks a lot like the early 20th century police department. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Right? You have an officer who you put out on the streets, and they check in at the end of the day. They make most of the decisions they have to make on their own, right? And kind of deal with these incredibly diverse set of problems and work out solutions on the fly. And it's like very familiar territory, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of fascinating to go back and look at how police departments wrestled with that challenge over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading that book when it comes out, and I wish you much luck with everything you're doing. I imagine, when is the book coming out, by the way, Malcolm?
Well, you and my publisher asking me these questions that make me uncomfortable. I don't know. I'm getting on it.
Yeah, you're working on it. Well, you've got a proven track record of getting them out, and I know the Bomber Mafia is relatively new, so you've got some time, certainly. Yeah. But I certainly thank you for joining us at Signal, and appreciate your insights, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.